So tonight's story is it's actually from the Beaver Book of Horror Stories. Check that guy out. Oh yeah. Um, so the Beaver Book of Horror Stories is edited by Mark Ronson. Not that Mark Ronson, a different one. Um, and I'm doing a video about his horror novels. And whilst I was researching that, I spotted that he edited the Beaver Book of Horror Stories, and there's one of his original stories in. It's aimed at a kind of a teenagey type audience, but it's quite a nice story actually. I quite liked it. So while I was reading it for my other video, just reading it to talk about, I just thought, oh, that'd actually make a really cool Sunday story. So tonight's story is called Changeling, and it's by Mark Ronson. Not that Mark Ronson, a different Mark Ronson. As they leaned their backs against the old dry stone wall, David gazed anxiously at the immense sky. It made him feel insect-like after living in a city where he hardly ever glanced upwards. Above was a serene summer blue, but from the west raced a flock of dark clouds, as though harried by a gigantic invisible sheepdog. "Do you think it'll rain?" he asked his cousin Janet. She held a pack containing their lunch, while he climbed a little clumsily over the wall into the pasture which sloped gently up Great Fell. "You've been on the border long enough to know that our weather changes on the hour," she laughed. "This wind'll soon sweep those clouds away. Look, there's the path to the tarn." David followed her over the coarse grass towards a distant line of trees. For the half hour it took to reach the trees, they hardly spoke. Each had their own thoughts. David's were mostly concerned with the slender, grey-eyed girl walking so easily over the rough ground ahead of him. David had been born in London and was visiting the farm owned by his Cumbrian relations. For the first couple of days he found it hard to adjust to its remoteness, to the fact that from his small bedroom window he could see no other human habitation on the rolling landscape. What also bothered him, and then delighted him, was the sky. In London it was something you saw between rows of rooftops or beyond high-rise buildings. Here it arched from horizon to horizon with a breathtaking sense of space, alive with wind that sighed or roared as though it possessed a mysterious life of its own. But most of all, David was attracted by his cousin, who was just a few months older than himself. Up until now he'd not felt any interest in girls, but Janet, with her black hair streaming as she rode her black pony round the farm, filled his mind with thoughts which would have made him laugh with embarrassment a few weeks earlier. Now it seemed the most important thing was to tell her something of what he felt, and to find out if it was possible that she might have some special feelings towards him. She'd been very friendly since her family had picked him up at the Carlisle railway station, but she was the sort of girl that was friendly with everyone. So far he'd not been able to be alone with her, which was why this picnic could be so important. If only the rain would hold off, they would have the whole afternoon together. He scanned the sky again and saw more clouds appearing over the western rim of the world. Sometimes one would pass beneath the sun for a minute, and they would find themselves walking in sudden shadow. Then magically the world would brighten again. When they reached the line of trees with branches stained with moss and twisted into gestures of surrender by the wind, David found that it was not a wood, but merely a shelter belt. Beyond it, a white ribbon of water plunged over a wall of reddish rock into a pool. "Isn't it splendid?" said Janet. "It's sheltered by the rocks." And the tarn is deep enough to dive into if you feel like having a swim. As she began to unpack, David asked, "What's that place over there? That roof sticking up in the middle of that clump of trees?" "Oh, no one ever goes there," Janet answered lightly. Perhaps a little too lightly, David was to think later. As they sat by the pool with the picnic spread out between them, David thought of the things he wanted to say to Janet, but somehow he couldn't find the right words with which to start. Not wishing to appear tongue-tied, he returned to the topic of the house. "Doesn't anyone live there anymore?" he asked Janet as she passed him a thick ham sandwich. "What did it used to be called?" "It hasn't got a proper name. And no one's lived there since the old man who owned it disappeared ages and ages ago. Long before I was born. Naturally, some of the kids at school say it's haunted, and the old man drowned himself in the tarn, but..." David gave a little shiver. "But what?" asked David. "Nothing, except it's not haunted by any ordinary old ghosts. Let's talk about something else. I never liked the look of that house, and the stories my brother Tom used to tell me about it when I was little gave me the creeps. How about pouring me some tea out of that thermos?" David unscrewed the cap. He was fascinated by the old country house without a name. In his bedroom at home, he had dozens of paperbacks about the supernatural. But this was the first so-called haunted house he'd seen. It would be something to tell his mates when he went back to school, especially old Watkins, who was always boasting about his aunt who was supposed to have second sight. "What did Tom tell you?" David asked. "Oh, stupid stuff," Janet said impatiently. "The older boys at his school passed it down to the younger ones, and so on. But I found it scary enough when Tom came into my room at night and teased me about it. Not that anything like that worries me now. Oh, thanks," she added as he passed over a plastic cup of steaming tea. David noticed that the tarn was no longer a bright reflection of the sky, and its surface crinkled into tiny ripples as the sound of the wind increased. "But what was supposed to have happened there?" he persisted. "If I tell you, will you just drop the subject afterwards?" Janet said. "It's only a silly story. Tom used to say that one night, long ago, a stormy night, naturally, a sort of fireball fell out of the sky, out of space, he actually said, and it landed on the old house. That was the night the owner was supposed to have vanished. And from then on, something remained in the house. A something that was invisible and evil. Oh, you know, a sort of demon." At that point, Tom never went into detail. He just made a lot of growling noises which made me duck under the bedclothes. So was that all? Not quite. The boys at his school believed that the something lurked in the house, waiting patiently for a person to go inside. Then it would take them over, changing that person into something horrible, like the being it had been before it came to Earth. Tom used to get a big laugh out of describing long teeth and funny skin and glowing eyes, until Dad found out about it, and that was the end of that. Oh, there was something else. The kids believed that if two people went into the old place, only one would be changed into the spirit thing, and he or she would hunt down the other. Sometimes Tom used to pretend that he was changing into an alien. He was really mean. "He seems nice enough now," David said, thinking of the pleasant young man who spent most of the day driving a tractor. I expect most brothers enjoy teasing their little sisters, said Janet. Suddenly, a scribble of lightning unzipped the darkening sky, and heavy raindrops made 1,000 rings on the surface of the pool. "Oh, we should have brought our raincoats," cried Janet. "We'll be soaked in a minute." "Let's shelter under the trees," David suggested, as he bundled the picnic things into the pack. "Never! Lightning always strikes the trees. I'd rather be drowned than frizzled." As though to emphasise her words, the sky was again shattered by cold flame. Thunder grumbled over the fells, and the world suddenly seemed to be a very sombre place. David, having to shout as a gust of wind whirled the rain about them, said, "We might find a dry spot in the old house." "Good idea. I'll race you." As Janet sprinted ahead of him, David decided that if she had once been scared of the house, that fear had long vanished. It turned out to be much larger than he expected, as if most of its stone bulk had been hidden by the trees and the undergrowth surrounding it. As they panted closer, he saw that the steep, slatted gables were really very high, like triangular rocks sticking up above a sea of threshing branches. The next moment they plunged into the trees, and it was here that they lost each other. David couldn't understand how it happened. 1 second he was behind Janet, the next her yellow sweater was out of sight. He halted among the trees and looked around him, calling a name, though his voice was drowned in a growl of thunder. Then he ran on through the undergrowth towards the house, confident that he would find her waiting for him, probably laughing at him from the shelter of the porch. He came out of the trees onto what had once been a driveway, now waist-high with willow herb, but there was no sign of the girl. The front door was partly open, and he decided that she must have gone inside. He followed into the dark hall, where he mopped his face with a damp handkerchief. How musty the place was, and the walls were curtained with spiderwebs. No one had lived here for years and years. No wonder the children at the local school had woven spooky stories about it. "Janet! Janet!" he called. No answer. He walked down a passage to an old-fashioned kitchen. The wooden furniture had rotted away. The great iron stove in the corner was red with rust. Only the tiles on the walls looked as they must have done before the old owner vanished. "Janet! Janet!" It was very odd. There was still no sign of her. But of course, she'd probably never even entered the house. She must be out among the trees, and he must go out and find her. Could it be that she still had some silly childhood fear of the house after all? Well, he could reassure her. There was nothing to worry about here, just an old abandoned house and nothing more. He started back along the passage, which was lit by lightning flashes through small paned windows, most of which had been cracked or broken long ago. But instead of reaching the front door, he found himself facing a flight of stairs. Strange. He didn't remember coming down them, but who remembers every move they make? He climbed up them to a landing, where a window showed him the tops of the trees tossing wildly in the wind. He turned to go back, but ahead of him stretched a corridor of blank, varnished doors. As he went slowly along it, the thunder died, and he heard a tapping sound coming from one of the closed rooms. With his heart pounding, he paused opposite it. He took a deep breath and flung open the door. He made a sound of disgust in his throat as he saw a carpet of dead birds lying on the ancient linoleum. Somehow, they'd managed to get into the room through a small gap in the window frame, and then had slowly starved to death. The tapping noise was made by a thrush, battering itself against a filthy pane of glass. Almost laughing at the simple explanation for his fright, David broke the glass. Immediately, the wind howling round the house plucked the bird to freedom. David returned to the corridor. The thrush would be all right. Now, he really must find Janet. She'd have a pretty poor opinion of him if he left her wet and shivering, and that was the very last thing he wanted. The problem with this place was that it was like a maze, and compared with the noise of the storm outside, strangely quiet. Perhaps Janet had come in, and she too had lost her way. For a moment, the idea of them both being confused in this old stone labyrinth seemed rather funny, and then rather alarming. "Janet!" He strode through a large room. To judge by the decaying furniture, it had once been a drawing room. Beyond it, he found himself on another landing. Oddly, the stairs led only up. A moment later he reached the top floor, where long ago servants and lumber had been lodged. David suddenly admitted to himself that he was terrified. The house was making him go where it wanted. But surely there could be no truth to the story which Janet had heard as a little girl. The idea of a something which could enter human beings and change them was just too far-fetched. And what was the rest of the tale? If two people entered the house, only one would change, and then begin the hunt. "Ah, that's crazy," David told himself out loud. "I'm scared all right, but not because of that. I'm scared because I'm stupidly lost in a spooky old house." Through dirty, low-ceilinged rooms, he ran, soft-footed, as though he feared that, by making noise, he would frighten himself even more. He reached the stairwell, and as he descended the spiral steps, he realised that what was so awful, just supposing there was a grain of truth in the old story, was that somewhere in this house Janet might have changed into what? Perhaps her face would be twisted into that of a monster. Perhaps her teeth would have grown beyond her lips. Perhaps those hands he wanted to hold so much were now claws. And if that was so, she would be hunting for him. He nearly burst into tears at the thought. To be scared of meeting the girl that you loved in case she was a changeling. He fled through the empty rooms and passages until suddenly he was back in the old kitchen. And there was Janet, just as he'd remembered her. What a lot of nonsense had filled his mind. "Janet! Janet!" His voice sounded different as he moved towards her with his arms outstretched. "Janet! I've been hunting everywhere for you." But Janet only screamed and screamed and screamed. For it was he who had changed. Thank you for joining me. Last one of 2020. I shall see you good folks in 2021. Happy New Year. Let's keep our fingers crossed that it's going to be still packed with fictional horror, but not actual horror. Stay safe, guys.